I met El Gordo, or the Fat One, as he wanted to be called for this show, in a dingy hotel room in a mining town close to Segovia, where we'd gone in search of blood gold. Gold that fuels violence and corruption, and which has supplied multinational jewelers like Tiffany's, as well as technology giants like Apple.
Si tiene un negocio, un depósito, así sucesivamente, a todo el mundo le cobran vacuna. Le cobran la plata a fin de mes, comienzan a cobrar desde el 20 hasta el 27. Son 7 días que comienzan a cobrar las vacunas.
El Gordo is a financiero, or money man. He does the books for a regional cell of the AGC, the Spanish acronym for the Gaitanista Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. The AGC is Colombia's most powerful criminal group, and it controls the informal mining trade in Segovia. I've known him for years. He is, as his name suggests, a large man, and he seems permanently angry. In the past, El Gordo had helped me understand the Colombian underworld. But he'd never agreed to a formal interview before. He was nervous, so we agreed to distort his voice to help protect his identity. They'd kill me if they knew I was talking to you, he told me. During our conversation, El Gordo explained how the AGC's shadow taxation system of mining operations had become more profitable than even drug trafficking for his particular cell. They calculate fees based on their own financial analysis, usually obtaining insider information about the operation's production and profits. If you own a mine or a processing mill, he said, they'll collect as much as $800 a month from you. They also collect fees for every bit of kit or machinery miners use, running from $500 to over $2,000, depending on the sophistication of the operation. On top of that, they collect 10% of monthly profits. But extortion is just the start. The AGC also owns informal mines, standing in the shadows behind a straw investor, as we repeatedly saw during our years-long investigation into the trade. Or they might be the owners of the things the informal miners need to work. Anything from processing plants and mining machinery to mercury and explosives. And as we'd find out later, the more gold mined and the more money at stake, the more the line between them and the miners begins to blur and eventually fade. You never know who you're working with, but you know never to ask. That's how a miner from a nearby town once put it to us. He was talking about the region's informal mines. But, as we were about to find out, that was a truth that ran much deeper than we were ever expecting. From Insight Crime, this is The Shadow of El Dorado, a series about the intricate web of corruption, violence, and complicity behind the gold trade in Segovia, and the story of how this once thriving Colombian mining town became a mafia stronghold. My name is Matt Charles.
And I'm James Bargent. Today's episode takes that story back to where it all began. This is episode 2, The Frontino Men. At Las Brisas, the informal gold mine in Segovia where we met Belomula, Jorge and Fabian last episode, they make a monthly payment to the AGC. They didn't like to talk about it, wouldn't get into the details with us, but there was no point in denying it. Of course they pay. Everybody pays. This was, in the simplest terms, the beginning of the blood gold supply chain that we'd set out to find. But it was not quite what we were expecting. Sat at the surface by the ventilator, pumping air down to the miners working the afternoon shift. We spoke about it with Jorge.
Los pequeños mineros somos chantajeados. Los pequeños mineros tenemos que pagar vacunas a las bandas criminales. Prácticamente nosotros somos robados.
The small-scale miners are blackmailed and abused by the armed groups. We're practically robbed, he said. And the government labels us as financiers of criminal gangs. But we're the victims. Beneath his calm exterior and measured words, Jorge was clearly angry.
Y yo creo que si nosotros fuéramos delincuentes no estaríamos metidos en un hueco a 200, 300 metros bajo tierra. Estaríamos extorsionando también.
If we were criminals, we wouldn't be down a hole 300 metres underground, he said. Having just spent the day down there with him, it was hard to disagree. Everything seemed so precarious, so dangerous. Caught between the law and the outlaws, they were only ever one step away from losing their livelihoods, or their liberty, or even their lives. And yet they were made out to be the villains. The miners in Segovia know their gold is illegal, that it's sold on the black market, then laundered into the supply chain, that can eventually reach millions of cell phones, bracelets, and necklaces. But the idea that the businesses and consumers at the other end of the supply chain shouldn't buy their gold because they have to pay off armed groups seems upside down to them. Someone steals money from them, and that makes their gold blood gold. But the miners don't just see a bitter irony in these contradictions. They see conspiracy with power.
Y el gobierno en estos momentos nos tacha como criminales, mineros criminales. Nosotros somos mineros informales, que no nos hemos legalizado totalmente por el gobierno, que el gobierno no nos ha dado las garantías.
This is Fabian, the administrator of Las Brisas, who we also met last episode. He said the government labels them as criminal miners, because if they're criminals, then the government has an excuse to drive them out and let big multinational mining companies take Colombia's gold for themselves.
Aquí en Segovia vivimos de la minería. Aquí no se cultiva, aquí no hay ganadería.
But where are they supposed to go? Here in Segovia, they live from mining. There's no farming, no ranching, just gold, he said. The vision that Jorge and Fabian laid out for us, of the combined powers of the state and big business criminalising a community in order to bulldoze its way of life, was something we would hear time and again all around Segovia. But it wasn't always like that. In fact, like most miners of a certain age, Fabian and Jorge used to work legally in the mines that now belong to the multinational they say is taking Segovia's gold for itself, Aris Mining, formerly known as Gran Colombia Gold. But those mines used to belong to another company called Frontino Gold Mines. We kept hearing about Frontino everywhere we went. All we wanted to do was talk about armed groups and mafias. But everyone else in Segovia wanted to talk about Frontino. They wanted to tell good old days stories about how much better everything was when the miners had a steady paycheck and generous benefits, all courtesy of Frontino. And they wanted to vent about how it had all gone wrong. The multinational takeover by Gran Colombia Gold, the mass firings and union busting that followed, the trail of destruction left by a hurricane of global capitalism. We could sympathise, but it's not why we were there. The gold produced by such a company might be ethically questionable, but we thought, it's not blood gold. This was not our story. But we were wrong. These were not separate stories. In fact, there was no way to pry them apart. And it all began with the slow death of Frontino gold mines.
Our understanding of what we were seeing in Segovia and what we'd come to see, its blood gold, all changed when we met Leonel Cavallo. We were at a bit of a loose end waiting for some interviews, so we decided to talk to some of those involved in the Frontino story. We figured it could at least make for some useful background, and after a couple of phone calls, we found ourselves at Leonel's door.
En esa casa vivo yo, vivo con mi familia. Esa casa, ahí llevo viviendo 27 años.
Leonel showed us around his old rundown Frontino workers' cottage, where he'd lived for the past 20 years. A relic of a bygone era. It had a sloping red corrugated iron roof, a remnant of the homesick architectural demands of the original British owners. He didn't grow up in Segovia, but his father's a local legend, Kiko Cavallo. He's popularly known as the saviour of Frontino. It was 1981 when Kiko wrote himself into local law. After it was founded by British prospectors in the mid-1800s, Frontino had grown into Colombia's biggest underground mining operation. But by the early 1980s, the company was in trouble. In the late 1970s, the foreign owners had been worn down by rising costs, harassment by left-wing insurgents, and constant strikes. So they took what they could, let the mines fall into disrepair, then left the Colombians who were managing them to pick up the pieces. The future looked bleak. and if the company went under, it could take Segovia with it. But Kiko, who was a retired Frontino miner, led the management to an abandoned mine where he'd worked decades before. The new mine promised untold riches, and it had the perfect name, Providencia, or Providence.
Empezaron a explotar a Providencia, entonces ya la gente ya se le pagaba era cada 10 días. Cada 10 días ya no se atrasaban, pagaron deudas.
Providencia kept Frontino afloat, Leonel said. And in return, all Kiko asked for was that his children would always be able to find work with Frontino. Leonel never really knew his father. The Frontino job, he would later say, was the only gift he ever received from Kiko. There were many others like Leonel.
Y ahí sí ingresé a la mina, pero porque sabía trabajar las elevadoras. Sabía manejar las elevadoras, entonces fue fácil entrar a la mina a manejar.
Leonel introduced us to Guillermo Vélez, whose father had also worked at Frontino. They're old friends from their days as union leaders, but have contrasting personalities. Leonel is reserved and thoughtful, while Guillermo is outgoing and talkative, very talkative.
Gente que vendía cuadros, gente que vendía ropa, gente que vendía frutas, ¿eh? Gente que vendía rifas, porque las rifas aquí en el pueblo han existido desde hace muchos años.
Guillermo lives in a nearby neighborhood of old Frontino housing, but he grew up just across the street from where Leonel lives now, and he took us to see his old house.
Cuando mi papá ascendió a jefe de garaje, le dieron esta casa, en la cual nosotros vivimos 16 años.
Like all the bigger houses, it was initially reserved for the foreign managers, the misters as they called them. But, Guillermo told us, when his father rose in the company, the house was given to him. It had what in those days passed as luxuries, a reliable water supply, a switchboard telephone, and it was big enough, by Segovia standards, for his father, mother, and 8 brothers and sisters to all fit. Unlike Leonel, Guillermo had never wanted to follow in the footsteps of his father. He left Segovia as a young man, first to serve in the military and then to work the giant dredges that churned for gold in Colombia's rivers. But he made his way home when he was around 40, underemployed and with few other options. He took a job at Frontino. Despite their differences, Leonel and Guillermo not only had a friendship, but a bond. They were of the same breed, hardy, proud miners with thick hands and calloused souls. The Frontino men. The Frontino men made up the backbone of Segovia for generations. But when we met them, Leonel and Guillermo were in their late 50s, and their lives had been reduced to a precarious existence. They lived job to job, working in construction, at a hotel, whatever they could find. They filled the gaps with side hustles, taxiing people around on a motorbike or delivering propane gas cylinders. And they woke up every morning knowing that they could be evicted from their homes at any moment by the Canadian multinational that now owns everything that was once Frontino. Guillermo, though, was always on the move, on the hustle. He had, in some way, moved on. But Leonel was almost visibly weighed down by sadness and bitterness. He tried to rebuild his life, but it was not the same world, and he was not the same man.
Y aquí hay mucho desempleo, esta mina, y mucha pobreza en este pueblo, a pesar de que es un pueblo rico en oro. A esto lo llaman la Puerta del Oro, el nordeste, la Puerta de Oro, Segovia, y la realidad no es esa.
It's not just them. All of Segovia has been reduced to this precarious state. Everything we were seeing, the crumbling buildings, the underemployment, the poverty, in some way or another, it could all be traced back to what happened to Frontino, Leonel told us.
Porque nosotros en la situación que vivimos siempre vivimos con temor, porque nunca nos hemos quedado quietos, todavía seguimos reclamando la empresa.
Both men were consumed by that story. It hung over their lives just as it hangs over Segovia.
Entonces estamos en esa situación esperando que alguien venga y investigue verdaderamente qué fue lo que pasó y que castigue a los políticos, que castigue a todos los que tuvieron que ver con este despojo que nos hicieron, con este robo. Es que eso fue un robo.
Because what happened to Frontino, Leonel said, was a robbery.
Y mucha pobreza en este pueblo, a pesar de que es un pueblo rico en oro.
When Leonel first arrived in Segovia, his father's discovery had revived the town. Business was booming, and Frontino, Leonel told us, was like a nurturing mother. Whatever people needed, she provided.
Porque uno ahí trabajando en la Frontino le da a uno para mantenerse bien con la familia, al menos el mercado, al menos las cosas personales. Salía uno cada 8 días a tomarse sus cervecitas, sus fresquitos, con la señora.
Leonel lived well from his share. He could pay the bills, keep everyone fed, and still have money left over to take his wife out for drinks every payday. The workers had stable job contracts, healthcare, housing, and pensions. Leonel's daughter went to the Frontino school. They even had rations from food produced on Frontino-owned farms.
Estamos en estos momentos en el lugar llamado la fonda de la empresa Frontino Gold Mines. Este edificio, construido por los años 40 con la finalidad de despachar a los trabajadores de la compañía la comida.
Guillermo took us to see La Fonda, a warehouse where workers would get that subsidized food to go with every paycheck.
La comida que era subsidiada, dándosela a los trabajadores en forma de raciones de acuerdo al grupo familiar.
Like so much of Frontino, it's a vestige of its golden era. Its once proud red roof is rusted and collapsing, its inside stripped. But back in the day, Guillermo told us, they used to line up jostling through the noisy queues to fill sacks with greasy packets of beef, plantain, yuca and panela, the brown slabs of raw sugarcane used in Colombia to make bitingly sweet drinks.
Por eso la importancia de este lugar, de la fonda. Esto tuvo vida propia. Y fuera de eso, este lugar servía de lugar de pago de los empleados cada 10 días.
This place had a life of its own, he said. On payday, which came every couple of weeks, the building would be surrounded by traders selling everything from fruit to clothes to raffle tickets. It was not just a place to get paid and get supplies, it was a meeting point for the entire town, and a place where it seemed like everyone benefited from Frontino's thriving gold mines. For the miners, Frontino was something you could build a life around. It made Leonel, Guillermo, and the other Frontino men feel secure, like there was a future for them and their families, and a future for Segovia. But more than that, it made them feel proud that they were part of something bigger. They felt that Frontino belonged to them as much as they belonged to it. And then one day, they found out that it actually did belong to them.
It all started around the turn of the century with the discovery of a document that's still talked about in Segovia in almost mythical tones, as if it were a religious artifact. El Acta de Nueva York, the Act of New York. The Act of New York, though, was no lost gospel. It was a declaration of the Frontino owners' intentions to pass the company into the hands of Frontino's workers and pensioners. But it was also not, despite how many Frontino men see it, a blessing from on high. It was really an attempt by Frontino's foreign investors to avoid liability, and it would get quickly subverted, leading to the slow unravelling of the company town Frontino created. We traced the story through contracts, letters and agreements going back over 40 years. When the company's foreign owners decided they were done with Frontino in the mid-1970s, they wanted to simply liquidate the company and walk away. But they couldn't because they were still on the hook for labour contracts and pension payments. At first, they tried to form a temporary administration that was given a year to turn the company assets into a pension fund, then hand everything over to the workers and pensioners. But that year passed, then another, and the administration had still not put things in order. Cue a series of frantic letters between the lawyers and the increasingly irate owners, who were still liable for their debts, but no longer making a penny from the company. That's when the owners and the lawyers met in a New York notary in March 1979. There, they signed a document authorising their Colombian lawyer and acting general manager of Frontino, a man named Dr. Franco Hidalgo, to transfer the company's assets to the workers and pensioners as soon as possible, so they could finally be done with the whole affair. At that point, under Colombian law, one more thing needed to happen for that document to be legally validated. Dr. Franco, as he's known in Segovia, needed to take it to a notary and enter it into the public record. Records show that he may have intended to do this. We found a copy of a letter from Dr. Franco to the relevant authorities dated 3 weeks after the Act of New York was signed. The Act of New York, it says, defines all the aspects related to ceding the company assets in favour of the workers and the pensioners, and it merits your acceptance. The document itself, it goes on, is being entered into the public record in one of the notaries of the Medellin notary circuit. But the Act of New York never made it to a notary. Instead, it was tucked away in Dr. Franco's office and the government archives. For their part, the workers and pensioners never found out, and Dr. Franco effectively took control of Frontino gold mines for himself and his associates. What followed was a strange period of corporate limbo, in which the company, because it was making so much money, could deflect attention from its failure to relinquish control, and at the same time placate the workers and pensioners.
No lo hicieron, más bien le daban bonificaciones y hacían gastos de pronto no muy necesarios para la empresa, pero no había voluntad de entregar la empresa a los trabajadores jubilados.
As Guillermo explained to us, every time a decision needed to be made on renewing Dr. Franco's supposedly interim administration, the management would find the money to pay out bonuses to all the workers to convince them to keep the status quo. Those same workers had no idea the company should already be in their hands. Frontino went on like this for over 20 years.
Aquí no había que liquidar nada, aquí ya estaba liquidado. Aquí había generado simplemente unos bienes que había que entregar.
All this time, Guillermo said, the company had already been liquidated, and all that remained was to hand over the assets to its creditors, the workers and the pensioners. The discovery of the Act of New York would change everything, they thought. And they were right, just not in the way they were thinking. Because at the same moment they were poised to take control of the company, something else was happening that would take it out of their hands. There have been mine robbers in the Frontino mines for as long as anyone can remember. The machuqueros, as they're called in Segovia, would creep in through ventilation shafts, then stay underground for months at a time. But they were little more than phantoms, haunting the mine's hidden crevices and forgotten corners. All that changed in 2001, with an invasion of what had long been Frontino's largest mine, El Silencio, the Silence. That invasion would become known as La Batea, meaning the gold pan. During La Batea, the machuqueros organised like never before. They hollowed out shafts that plunged straight through the earth and rock. They knocked down support columns and blew up transport tunnels and ventilation shafts. Hundreds of machuqueros soon became thousands, and each day they went deeper and deeper. El Silencio became a living ruin, but a lot of people were getting very rich. Not only the machuqueros, but also those taking a cut of the profits in exchange for letting it all happen. Corrupt politicians, police and army officials, collaborators among the workforce, and, according to public allegations made by the unions, some of the company administrators. The money appeared everywhere. New motorbikes roaring through the streets, bars full at any time of day and every time of night, mills and traders springing up on every other street to process and sell the stolen gold. It was a whole new economy, and it was the beginning of the large-scale, uncontrolled informal mining that would come to define Segovia by the time we arrived some 15 years later. It was also the moment that Segovia, the company town, began its descent into Segovia, the mafia town. Because there was something else to this phenomenon, something even more troubling and sinister. Something armed with assault rifles and decked out in camouflage. They stood at the entrance to the mine shafts and outside the mills. They checked who was working and how much they were earning, and they claimed their cut of the gold sacked from El Silencio. They were the paramilitaries of the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, known by the Spanish acronym as the AUC, and they wanted Frontino's gold for themselves.
Critics say AUC soldiers have killed several thousand people. The victims include more than 150 union activists murdered in the last 16 months, as well as dozens of human rights activists and leftist politicians. Authorities say the paramilitaries pulled their victims off of buses and out of homes before shooting them.
The paramilitaries were a byproduct of Colombia's civil war, a right-wing reaction to the left-wing guerrilla groups that had been trying to overthrow the state since the 1960s. They began as ad hoc death squads and rural militias, but by the time of La Batea, they'd become a nationwide counterinsurgency and major players in the Colombian underworld. Leonel's first run-in with Colombia's paramilitary groups had come a few years earlier, and it's what led him to become a union leader in the first place.
Porque en el 97 mataron a un sindicalista que llamaba Rafael Guardia. Lo mataron los grupos paramilitares que llegaron al municipio. Lo mataron por la calle Bolívar.
The paramilitaries had murdered a Frontino union leader. This was common. The paramilitaries were a shadow regime, government proxies in the dirty war against anyone perceived to be collaborating with or even sympathetic to the guerrillas. And that included the unions. The war had put the unionists in an impossible position. The insurgents would often express solidarity with the union struggle. Rejecting the guerrilla support would be risky, but by not saying anything, they were seen as fellow travelers in their armed struggle and legitimate targets for paramilitary killers. Segovia had long been a guerrilla stronghold, and so the Frontino Miners Union often found itself squarely in the paramilitary sights.
Toda la gente del sindicato se fue para Medellín de miedo y que ya no iban a volver.
What was not common was what happened next. The rest of the union leadership had fled Segovia, Leonel told us, and they called up Leonel and asked him to act as a go-between with the local paramilitary commander. Leonel accepted, and he successfully negotiated their return to town. Impressed, and struggling to fill the vacant leadership position, the union asked him if he wanted to join their team.
El sindicato porque la gente estaba tan temerosa que no querían hacer parte del sindicato. Les daba miedo.
Everyone else was too afraid, he told us. But Leonel said yes. It was not long after that the union found the Act of New York. They saw the opportunity it contained, but they also saw the risks. La Batea had left the company vulnerable. There were murmurs that Frontino was a write-off, and the only solution was to sell it off, shut it down, and start over. To stop that happening, they needed more than just the Act of New York. They needed money. So they met some American investors who offered them $55 million to put the company in order if they could use the Act of New York to claim legal ownership of Frontino. But the war got in the way once more. As soon as news about their arrangement with the investors got out, rumors swirled that the money was coming from leftist guerrillas. After the rumors came the whispers. The paramilitaries had drawn up a list of targets. At the top of the list were 4 Frontino union leaders. But only 3 names on that list reached the union. The 4th remained a mystery.
Porque fueron allá y le dijeron, vea, van a matar 4 del sindicato. Y dieron los nombres de ellos 3, pero el mío no lo dieron.
The 3 on the list contacted the paramilitaries and arranged to meet the commander. There they explained it was all a mistake. It was US businessmen, not communist insurgents, who were promising them money.
Fue y conversó con él, le dijo, no, escucha eso muchacho, eso no es así, a usted le están diciendo mentiras.
The commander listened. He accepted their story and called off the hit, at least for the 3 men at the meeting. But there was still the question of the 4th name.
¿Dónde está el otro, Carvalho? Y él dijo, pero ¿cómo así que Carvalho?
And where is the other one? Where's this Cavallo? He asked them. As Leonel tells it, he was with a friend, working their way through a liter of aguardiente, Colombia's local firewater, when he got the call from the others to tell him he was the 4th name on the list.
Hermano, vea, métase donde sea porque el cuarto era usted. Vaya escondas, hermano, no vaya para su casa. Quédese por ahí en la calle, quédese en otra parte, mirar dónde se va a quedar.
Listen, they've called off the hits, but he can't reach his men to tell them, so don't go home. They're waiting for you there. If they see you, they're going to kill you, they told him. Leonel started shaking with fear.
Entonces León, que estaba ahí conmigo, me decía, no, cálmate. Venga, vámonos ya.
Come on, we need to go now, his friend told him. He grabbed the bottle and set off with a swig. If they're going to kill me, he thought, they can kill me drunk. The paramilitary leader eventually reached his men, and the hit was called off. The next day, Leonel woke up, hungover but alive. The relief, though, wore off quickly, as the union leaders began to understand the implications of what had just happened. the paramilitaries held their company, their town, and their very lives in their hands.
After escaping their narrow brush with death, the threats against them continue, spiking any time any of them spoke out or tried to take action against La Batea. Still, the Union pressed on with their plan to deploy the Act of New York. By now, the risks were clear, but they felt like they had little choice. So on August 6, 2003, 24 years and 4 months after it was first signed, one of the leaders went to a Medellin notary and entered it into the public record. The union called a creditors' assembly for the workers and pensioners when a motion to accept the Frontino assets passed. A week later, the union leaders wrote to the government to formally accept the transfer of the assets, and they wrote to the President of Colombia to ask for his support in their claim. The Frontino men had made their play, and now they had to wait. The response came quickly, but it didn't come from the company management or from the government. It came from them, the paramilitaries. And not just one of them, but one of the very worst of them. One of the most notorious names in Colombia's blood-stained history. It came from Macaco. That's next time on The Shadow of El Dorado. This series was the product of 8 years of investigation and on-the-ground fieldwork. This sort of work can be slow and painstaking, and it can be dangerous. It can also be expensive. If you want to help Insight Crime continue to produce in-depth investigations and analysis of organised crime, you can make a donation at insightcrime.org. If you want to dive deeper into the story of Segovia and blood gold in Colombia, head to our website at insightcrime.org. There you can see videos and photos of the scenes described and interviews with key characters. Explore documents laying out the paper trail we uncovered during our investigation, and delve deeper into some of the stories and people mentioned in this podcast. The Shadow of El Dorado is an Insight Crime podcast produced with La No Ficción. It was reported and written by me, James Bargent, and produced by Matt Charles. Script editing was by Stephen Dudley and Tatiana Lozano with the help of Elisa Roldan. Stephen and Elisa are the executive producers of the series. Sound design and editing for this episode was by Valentina Fonseca, and our graphic designer is Isaoela Soto. Fact-checking for this episode was done by Alejandra Rodriguez.